Financial Statecraft. I'm Teddy Downey, Executive Editor here at the Capital Forum, and today's guest is my good friend, Graham Steele. He is the former Assistant Secretary for Financial Institutions at the U.S. Department of Treasury. He is currently an academic fellow at the Rock Creek Center for Corporate Governance at Stanford Law School. This comes on the heels of being in the Senate for many years in working for Sherrod Brown, and is probably, I think, best known for authoring the Break Up the Banks legislation and being part of that conversation. We're going to be talking with him about his recent paper, Financial Statecraft, and a bunch of other really interesting topics in the discourse today. Graham, thank you so much for doing this today.
Absolutely, Teddy. Thanks for having me.
And before we get started, if you have questions, we're going to take questions towards the end. Submit them to the questions pane of the control panel. We'll try to get them at the end of the conversation. First, Financial Statecraft, very interesting. Walk us through why you wrote this paper.
Yeah, it kind of came out of some things I was seeing during my stint at Treasury. I mean, initially, the ideas and the kernels of it came from an article I wrote a few years ago in the Chicago Business Law Review about this law called the EDGE Act of 1919, which was this pretty obscure banking law passed after World War I, where Congress was sick of spending money, of making fiscal expenditures to finance the war effort and to help, in particular, its European allies. It didn't want to absorb the cost using public funds anymore. And so the idea they came up with this law was, let's deregulate the banking system. Let's let US banks do more activities abroad over in Europe. They'll be the ones to finance all of this European reconstruction and the fallout from World War I, and we won't have to pay for it anymore in the first instance. And when there are profits to be made, we're down to the benefit of these private banks, and that'll be good for the US economy and US economic competitiveness. So this was sort of this old law that I had heard a little bit about, that I wanted to dig into its roots, and found that that was the sort of motivating factor behind why Congress passed that law. And then I went to the Treasury and was watching. I was on the domestic finance side, and so I had one particular set of interactions with financial institutions, which was mostly the way that domestic financial regulators interact with them and think about how to make sure that they are safe and sound, that they are serving their communities, and then they're not creating financial instability that causes financial crises. But there are other offices of the Treasury that are they have their own agendas that are doing different things with these banks. So there's an international affairs office that is trying to enlist these private financial institutions in international economic development programs like the Sustainable Development Goals through like the World Bank and the IMF. So it's trying to get them to invest abroad consistent with a set of geopolitical and social goals that the government had on one hand. But then you also have a terrorism and financial intelligence office that administers anti-money laundering and sanctions rules, that is using that same set of financial institutions, like when Russia invades Ukraine, to try to cut Russia out of the US dollar-based system. And so what I want to do with the paper was sort of flesh out, like, what is this partnership between the US government and financial institutions, where the US uses these sets of institutions to further its geopolitical interests? Like, how does that operate through these private banks in the first place? And then sometimes there are other public authorities that are brought to bear too, like the Federal Reserve and some of its emergency lending and its dollar swap lines. Treasury Department has some funding mechanisms like its Exchange Stabilization Fund. Like, I just wanted to set up a framework to try to fully capture how the government uses money, credit, and financial institutions to project its geopolitical prerogatives, in particular in the global dollar-based system, where the US has what's called the exorbitant privilege, where the fact that the US dollar is a reserve currency sort of puts it at the center of the economy and geopolitics. So that was part one of the exercise, was like, what is the government even doing here when it's trying to deploy financial institutions like that?
I feel like the Trump administration is like the perfect time to be looking at this type of framework in a sense that like you couldn't get more aggressive geopolitical goals and that sort of diverge from historical norms, which I'm not saying they're beyond critique, those norms. I find them objectionable on many levels, but we don't need to get into that right now. I mean, well, I guess that's what I'm trying to get at, is like you have these sort of like ways of doing things that are sort of established norms that have had catastrophic outcomes. And then you have Trump coming in doing something that's seeming like really different, but I'm not sure the outcome is really any better necessarily. Tell me about what were the highlights from your paper and like how it's sort of fits into today's, what we're experiencing.
Yeah, I mean, one part of the framework I'm trying to construct here to really understand this sort of partnership arrangement is applies across administrations, and it's just applies to the normal way in which most administrations have tried to use this system. And a couple of things that I try to focus on are the idea of a push and a pull between the way that the US tries to deploy dollar-based finance for these purposes. So sometimes it is trying to provide as much access as possible to these financial resources. Sometimes it's flowing directly through well-regulated banks that might be too big to fail, but are globally dominant. And so it's trying to get everyone to rely on US financial institutions. Sometimes it's channeled through other sort of dollar-based markets that operate offshore, like the US, like the Eurodollar market. Sometimes it's trying to preserve US Treasuries as the global safe asset that all investors want access to. But all administrations have sort of had this policy of trying to make, or at least since the Bretton Woods Agreement, of trying to maintain this dollar-based system and have the US be central to it. And on the one hand, provide access to everybody. But sometimes they also want to choke off that access and control it and turn off the spigot when they're having a conflict with someone where they're trying to create leverage over them. And even under what I'll call quote unquote normal times, managing that balance between when you give access and want all of this financing to sort of spread across the globe, but how you can suddenly turn on a dime and turn that spigot off without creating financial instability, to me is one of the central tensions in trying to administer this system. And if policymakers don't understand what they're doing and aren't thinking intentionally about how they manage that tension, about how to provide access, but also shut it off and sort of moderate it, they're going to create a whole set of byproducts of things like financial instability. They're going to further the too big to fail problem. They're going to have to bail out some of these markets and institutions if they mismanage. We've seen episodes dating back to the 70s, 80s, but even after things like the Russian invasion of Ukraine, where financial stress and instability has sort of weakened the ability of the US to use some of these financial tools. So that's point number one, is like, even when you have an administration that understands what it's doing and trying to accomplish, and all trying to act in a concerted effort, it's really hard to manage this tension between access and control. But then you look at what this administration is trying to do in particular, and it's further complicating a lot of those dynamics and those tensions, because you got one camp, like the Mar-a-Lago Accord group here, that wants to do protectionist stuff, that said that maybe the US should step back from this exorbitant privilege of having the dollar be in the middle of this system, wants to do things like impose fees on holders of US Treasuries to try to sort of back off from this centrality. So there's like a protectionist version here that wants to do tariffs and wants to do sanctions and wants to use a lot of these tools in sort of the coercive way. But then you've got a separate camp, I guess you could think of them as globalists in some sense, but like who want to continue using some of these tools expansively, might want to continue something like a strong dollar policy. You can look at what they're doing in Argentina, for example, of sort of helping the regime there. Like they're still wanting to provide access and provide access to dollar-based financing. So there are sort of two camps with two different theories about whether the US ought to stay in the middle of this system or not, where you don't really see a coherent theory coming out about, number one, what should the role of the US dollar and US finance be in this system, but if also we're going to move to a different system, how do you transition that? What does the governance of that look like? Who are we collaborating with? And so that just creates a lot of uncertainty about the way this policy itself is supposed to operate. That raises the stakes of the whole enterprise. But then the second piece of this is that they also want to, a central part of their economic theory and how to make the US globally economically competitive is we'll deregulate the financial sector and we will unleash our global systemically important banks, and they'll leverage themselves up. And again, they'll make profits and that'll be good for us. But again, you mismanage this statecraft, you're going to create financial instability, and then you've deregulated the financial system and made it less resilient, and you're going to end up with this sort of doom loop of bad statecraft creates financial stress, which then creates crises, which then lead to bailouts. And so one of the arguments I'm making in the paper is like there's got to be a coherent theory here, and the way in particular they're thinking about financial deregulation is only going to undermine this system of statecraft over the long run.
This gets me to a broader question, and then let's dive into all the. You just covered so many interesting, timely topics. We'll dig more into that. But from a broader standpoint, I find what I find troubling about the way that financial statecraft works is that it feels profoundly undemocratic. It feels profoundly unaccountable. And so I just read this book about Chile, for example. You get you get a democratically elected socialist leader, and they just cut off the economy to Chile, destroy the economy. It creates a coup, and you get Pinochet. I mean, like it's just like a couple of people in the U.S. government making that happen, determining that. And so like that idea that who gets rewarded or punished with this financial statecraft, to me, feels deeply problematic and something probably Congress should need to get involved in, not really the purview of a random bureaucrat or a Larry Summers type who's just thinks they're very smart, or someone in the State Department, whatever, who just unaccountable and willing to punish an entire society for their political views. I find what's your kind of overall, putting aside, by the way, I'm not saying Chile was doing a good job at being socialist or whatever, but you've got this democratically elected government that's just like being unilaterally punished. And then we can come up with a million other examples of that, how financial statecraft has like either been misused or used to punish societies unjustly or what have you. But what's your overall take on the accountability or lack of accountability, and sort of, is that a problem when you're talking about this system?
Yeah, wow, there's a lot there to unpack in your question. I think a first component of what you're saying is that there's the goals of this regime get muddied a lot of the time. Like what the US government is actually doing when it's deploying these tools, they sort of deploy different arguments at different times, try to rationalize the reason in which they're bringing these tools to bear. But the common theme across most of them, when you really unpack them and sort of get beneath the surface and look through some of the superficial arguments, is the US is doing what it thinks is its own national self-interest globally. There's not really a lot of the time a coherent thread that is like they're promoting democracy necessarily, or they're always promoting capitalism or fighting something like communism or socialism. At various points when these tools have been deployed, they've been used to sometimes prop up dictators. They've been sometimes used to support governments that don't ostensibly share the values that the US has. But in strategic moments, the US government has felt like we need to support these other enterprises. And one of the ways in which we do that is we use financial tools. The flip side of that is certain entities or countries need to be punished for a variety of reasons. So sometimes the arguments are couched in something like financial stability or systemic risk. If there's a currency crisis in a particular country, it will have international spillovers. But you look through that rationale and you see, well, no, it's just the US government probably likes the government that's in this country. And so it wants to support them, and it will provide financing to them on largely favorable terms. The other side of that, the other version of that is there are some countries that the US disfavors for a variety of reasons. You can think of global South countries in this category where financing will be provided to them either directly or through international financial institutions, think the IMF or the World Bank, but there'll be harsh and punitive financial terms that are applied to that financing that require political reordering, debt restructuring, things that have to do fundamentally with them restructuring their own domestic politics in a way that the US thinks it likes and is consistent with what the US's global project is. Again, couched in things like fiscal discipline and having them get their house in order, but that are deeply political and about geopolitical prerogatives more so than something based on some sort of principles of good finance and good financial management. And like pulling up one level from that, then, you know, one of the points that I think is worth exploring in some of my own future projects, at least, is the way in which finance is a tool that is seen by, in particular, some of these technocrats that are responsible for financial governance as sort of being a costless enterprise in a way. You can create leverage over these societies without having to deal with a lot of the messiness of foreign policy or direct military conflict. But that view obscures the way in which finance itself can further a lot of harmful projects. That the deprivation of financial resources means countries can't feed their own citizens or can't build out their own infrastructure or, you know, sort of further some of their own projects. So the way in which human rights and finance actually have these deep connections, just thinking about it as a purely financial enterprise obscures a lot of the moral stakes of some of this broader project. Yeah, and then there's a question about like the actual legal mechanisms through which these tools themselves are operating. So some of the Federal Reserve and Treasury tools are off balance sheet. They are not appropriated through the congressional appropriations process. And so it sort of feels costless to the United States government and a lot of the officials that run it, because it's like we're just creating money using the central bank or using the Treasury, and Congress really can't tell us what to do because there aren't a whole lot of oversight mechanisms there. A second problem for Congress is that a lot of the emergency statutes the president uses to administer this system, like the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, the law he's used for tariffs, but is used for dollar sanctions and some other measures, are just very, very broad delegations of authority that don't have a whole lot of oversight and a whole lot of checks on them. Some of it's being litigated right now, but one of the proposals I make is that Congress really needs to rein in some of these powers and take back some of the role about who ought to be at the table in making these decisions and the basis on which the decisions themselves ought to get made. But so they're just ripe for abuse. And some of it is just like overuse and using it in ways that are not consistent with what Congress wants them to do. But the really robust version of this is the president starts channeling it to businesses that he owns or friends of his, or the Treasury Secretary wants to help Argentina, but it also wants to help his friends who runs investment funds that have a lot of exposure to the Argentine peso. So there are ways in which it can be used inconsistent with congressional objectives and prerogatives, or just totally used as a tool of corruption and sort of personal enrichment. The last thing that I would also note is there's an interesting balance between the distribution of power between the government and private financial institutions in this system. If large global banks and other financial institutions become so central to the way that the US government transmits geopolitics, that I think you could rightly question at what point the private institutions have all the leverage in this situation. When they become the tool of first resort and the first set of instruments the government goes to when there's an armed conflict is we want to use dollar sanctions, we want to use some of these anti-money laundering tools, or we want private banks to finance a lot of our social goals and social objectives, who really has the power in that relationship in that moment? And what leverage does it give to private financial institutions? There have been times in our history where private banks, you can think of JP Morgan prior to World War II, it was one of the biggest bankers for the Axis powers leading into World War II, and the US government was not a fan of that. But what were they going to do to rein in the most powerful bank in the world? And how are they really going to push back and pull them in? So part of it is the way that the government can use these tools, but also part of it is a question about at what point does the government cede power to private actors who are really getting to do their own version of private foreign policy in this relationship.
And on top of that, I would also add, what are they asking in return, right? Like if you're running a bank, you might be like, yeah, sure, I'll cut off Russia, but like I want deregulation, I want no oversight of derivatives, and I noticed during the Obama administration, I wonder, I mean, that's the time I have a strongest memory of how all these rules were being rewritten. There were just a lot of times where it felt like it, because you mentioned that there's like not a huge, it's not really coherent between the State Department and these policies and the domestic priorities. It can be incoherent at times, but what was coherent was anytime the banks were doing something for the government, they were looking for something in return, I think, favors. And so I want to ask you directly about that. Is that an issue also? Is that like, hey, they think they're earning goodwill and they want to get a return on their doing what the government wants?
Yeah. So I think there's three different ways in which you can think about that dynamic operating, and again, that balance between public and private power. One is just the general argument, which as you're referring to, and when you referred to my prior work around dealing with too big to fail banks, one of the arguments that you hear a lot when you talk about more regulation of the financial sector is, well, if you rein it in too much, if you regulate it too much, the activity is going to go overseas, we're not going to be globally competitive, and we're not going to be central to this entire system anymore. So it's like a general argument of, we got to have the biggest banks in the entire world, because that redounds to our benefit when it comes to economic competitiveness, but also for some of these foreign policy purposes, we're not going to be central to this system anymore if government takes too heavy of a hand here. So it's like a high level, we got to have these globally dominant banks. And that it is an unmitigated good to have a lot of US-based finance. My argument is that actually the quality of that finance matters a lot. And then you really, a sort of out of control financial sector has more costs than it does benefits in this system. A second argument, or a second move that the banking industry will make when it's presented with some of these policies is like a direct connection between some of these statecraft activities and specific regulations. So you will see them say, okay, you want me to do more of this financing activity. Well, let me point you to a specific part of the risk-based capital rules or leverage requirements that we are subject to, or derivatives regulations that are hindering our ability to specifically do cross-border activities, or to operate in London, or to offer some of these derivatives to some of these other counterparties that are part of the statecraft toolkit that you want us to be doing. So like an explicit connection of this specific regulation is hindering our ability to do this kind of work. And it's a move they make when it comes to some of these kind of statecraft related considerations. They've also done it in the climate space sometimes too. Like we've wanted to do more climate financing, but the capital rules are so onerous, we can't do it. You got to roll these back for us. So that's about specific rules that are directly tied back to some of these statecraft purposes. There's a third move, which I did not put in the paper because it's hard to actually pin down. You don't see it talked about publicly, but which I think happens behind closed doors in some of these conversations, where you have a political agency, like let's say the National Security Council, hypothetically, or like the Treasury Department, that cares about statecraft first and foremost, approaches one of these financial institutions and says, we want you to help, help push back against China, or help respond to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And then the institution will say, we'd love to, but also like our supervisors are really on our backs a lot. And if you could just get them to ease up, on these other rules that are unrelated, or more generally, just kind of give us a break, that'll give us the operating space to then think about how we administer these anti-money laundering rules, or how we can comply with the sanctions regimes. So it ties unrelated regulations and supervisory policy, but just sort of says, in a soft quid pro quo kind of way, like, you give us our deregulation, we'll get on board with your project, we'll all be happy, win-win, and then we can all get what we want out of this regime. And that really then puts pressure on fundamentally the political agencies in the first instance to then turn around to the independent financial regulators, who've got to be thinking about the safety and soundness of these financial institutions and the stability of the entire financial system, to then turn around and say, like, you're getting in the way of our foreign policy prerogatives. Can't you lighten up? What's the big deal here? And so it puts political agencies at cross purposes to some of these independent financial regulatory agencies that care about things like financial stability. And so there's sort of three ways in which this can work, some of which are sort of explicit and out there, and some of which work in a sort of softer way where these partnership dynamics come into play a little bit.
And so in terms of, and I promise we'll get into the meaty topical things in a second, but just think about the paper. And in terms of what is a system that is like, I think there are two things that kind of stand out, is the lack of transparency and lack of accountability when it comes to these financial decision makers. I mean, listen, I do investigative journalism for a living, and as many times as I've tried to crack the Fed, and I've tried to get people to go crack the Fed, it continues to be tricky. Treasury, yeah, same way. I mean, you honestly are better off just talking to these Wall Street participants than you are trying to figure out what's actually going on at the Fed, because they're calling up the Wall Street people more than they are talking to anyone else. What is your view of creating more transparency, or does there need to be more transparency? Does there need to be more accountability? How do you do that? And then on the flip side, how do you make it so that the whole, let's say there is a more coherent structure to this financial statecraft, where you are integrating with the State Department, with your human rights goals in a coherent, holistic way, where that whole strategy makes A, more sense, and B, is more feels more democratic, that there aren't just these arbitrary people when it comes to different government kind of doing things in their little orbit where they have power, with the Fed being, having the most leeway with their own money, like you're saying, just sort of going off and doing their own thing.
Yeah, I mean, one of the first things I was trying to do with this project, in addition to the reform suggestions that I had and some of the specific case studies that I try to unpack about how the system operates, was just in the first instance to lay out a framework where I'm trying to say, here's what I think all these agencies are doing. Here's the comprehensive framework I'm trying to put out there about the ways they're using deposits, payment systems, the provision of credit. Here's all the different laws that apply here, the agencies that are involved, then the way they deploy these tools as part of what is a comprehensive framework that isn't explicitly connected and isn't sort of put out there by the government as here's what we're trying to accomplish and all the ways we're trying to accomplish it. So step one for me is to put out here's what I think that they're doing. I hope that there will be some dialogue now where if some of these agencies, they're this is not actually what we're doing these two other things over here. I would love to have them be explicit about it and be more transparent about it. I think one of the issues in this space, because it straddles the worlds of independent agencies who are financial regulators that have one set of statutory missions and purposes and authorities, and the political agencies that have a separate set of missions around economic competitiveness and foreign policy, is that these goals are not stated and they're not explicit about it. The relationships are sort of soft and informal in a lot of cases. Agencies that feel like they're getting up to the line of where their responsibilities end and someone else's start and particularly I think the independent regulators are a good example of this, don't want to be explicit about how they view what authorities they're using, when they're using them, and how they're using them, and sort of which category it falls into versus financial stability, regulation, or statecraft. They want to operate in a world of what they view as constructive ambiguity, but my argument in the paper is that that ambiguity is creating a whole set of problems. It's a lack of clarity about what this system is and does and is trying to accomplish. But then also it's going to create a whole bunch of these other byproducts, including financial instability, but also inequality. It's going to lead to bad statecraft. It's going to have a whole lot of these other consequences that are going to be really bad for a lot of stakeholders, the government itself that's trying to do this stuff included. And so one of my goals here is to have more transparency, to have these agencies more explicit about what they're trying to do, and then have Congress oversee that and have them come up and talk about it and be clear. Because my theory here is step one is acknowledging you have a problem. And then step two is thinking about what you're going to do about it and how you're going to address that problem. And so I've got some reforms. I mean, Congress has acceded to this structure a lot over the recent decades. I think because it has similarly viewed this as, in some sense, a little bit of a low-cost regime. Like I said, they're not having to appropriate dollars to do this, to fund foreign policy. It can happen off balance sheet in a lot of ways. Private institutions will govern it, or some of these agencies will use regulatory tools, or just create money in order to do it. So it seemed convenient in that way. It was, again, also seen as a costless way, a way to avoid having direct military conflict. When I was working in Congress, I was as guilty of this as anybody else. I was the chief counsel for the Democratic staff, the banking committee, in years when we expanded tools like economic sanctions to be used against Iran or Russia. And there was a sort of ratchet effect where more and more authority is being delegated to the executive branch to use these tools, because Congress didn't want to be in the business of having to weigh in the first instance and then acknowledge what was happening in this regime and the costs of it. And so part of my argument here is Congress, you got to get back in the game here. You got to rein in this structure. You got to have more of a balance between what your prerogatives are, because you're elected by the people, and not just let either the president have all the power here, or have a bunch of unelected technocrats be the ones that are making the decisions in the first instance. And so part of this is like, what is really going on in this regime? And then step two is have more robust legal controls and guardrails around it, so that agencies are not abusing their powers and sort of getting out of what the broader public wants to be done in this space.
One last question before we get into the Argentina and other current topics in more depth.
Yeah.
One assumption in all of this is that U.S. financial institutions are not predatory and punitive towards the citizenry, right? Because like you could be a sicko and be like, we'll unleash our financial institutions on you if we don't like you. That's what I would do, some of these companies. But what is the need to have rules so that is not happening, that these financial institutions aren't focused on predation and domination? Because obviously exporting that, first of all, having that in your own society is bad enough, but you start exporting that willy-nilly, I mean, you're not helping anybody really in the long run. And so unless you want them to be dominated, which I guess is another matter entirely, it is sort of like not really within the scope of what they're hoping to do, I don't think. But this comes up with trade, and I think this is more well known when we're talking about big tech, because that's part of the trade discussions now and things like that, and regulation. But I think you could think of that more broadly as like, what's the role of rules of competition and rules that regulate predation and domination?
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to start with a fundamental question about like, what is the US's role in this dollar-based system, and how does it administer this idea of this exorbitant privilege? Is it an idea where it is the global financial hegemon, And so it's just going to throw its weight around in this system. And basically, it will dispense benefits to its allies. It will try to coerce its adversaries into this system. Yeah, so like, does it view itself as the singular global actor who can impose its will on others? Or is it trying to be a benevolent administrator of a multilateral global financial system that happens to use the US dollar as the reserve currency? So does it see itself as having to do like coalition building and thinking about how it's dispensing the benefits and trying to build goodwill? Or is it always just trying to impose itself on other geopolitical actors? And I don't think there's been a coherent view of that over time. Sometimes within administrations, there hasn't been a coherent view of when it's trying to use coercive measures versus supportive measures. And then certainly from administration to administration, they've had different views, I think, of what their theory is of how the US is supposed to act here. There are implications for the effectiveness of this regime if there's too much confidence or you sort of overstate the ability of the US to be a unilateral global actor. Other countries will try to de-dollarize in some way. If the US is just a bad steward of its own financial system, it will lose its centrality because it will show itself as not being capable of actually ensuring its own financial stability and its interest in preserving the rule of law. And being too much of a politicized domestic financial system, I think, will help cede its centrality here. So the way in which the wrong theory about what the US is trying to do will actually be self-defeating and lead to its ceding its central role in this entire system. But then I think a thing you're also asking about is like, how do the domestic dynamics of financial exclusion or predatory inclusion play out globally when the US is doing provisioning to other countries and other regions and other populations? And yeah, I think what policymakers think the US's role within this system is then translates into how they try to administer it to exclude certain populations because they view them as unworthy of having access to these financial resources, have no compunction about freezing assets in certain countries because they want to turn the screws on them and don't necessarily see their populations as being equal or worthy of having access to those resources and having sovereignty in their own right. Or do they dispense subsidies and benefits to them and give them financing on really permissive terms because they see that because the US government sees those other countries and populations as part of the same political project. And so again, I think being too, and I guess another corollary to that is, do they view the project as basically an extractive scheme where US financial institutions are trying to make maximum profit globally that will redound to the US's economic competitive advantage? Or it is a long-term issue of how you have global sustainable finance that then sort of leads to a set of benefits that benefit the government geopolitically? And so I think which theory the US government has leads to different outcomes in different situations and leads to certain countries and regions having standing swap lines with the Fed while others don't. Certain ones getting financing from Treasury's Exchange Stabilization Fund or from one of these international financial institutions on permissive terms, while others have restructuring and other punitive terms imposed on them. Who is seen as risky from a money laundering perspective and who is not, and therefore who is de-risked from US banks while who has access. There are a whole bunch of these value decisions about who ought to have access to US finance that are not technocratic. They have deep political and geopolitical implications, but this system and the way it's administered treats them as matters of just mere financial administration, as opposed to having sort of values embedded within them as well. And I mean, it's a sort of international corollary to the ideas of redlining that have happened here in the US traditionally, or the kind of subprime predation that happened before the financial crisis. It's just happening at a global scale internationally instead of happening here domestically.
I mean, I could talk about that all day. That's so fascinating, the different layers there. But I promised we would get into what's going on with the Trump administration. We are finally there, 40 minutes in. Thank you for staying with us. We are finally here. Argentina, to your point, bailing out a government that is politically on thin ice and that has the Treasury Secretary's friends betting on it, seems deeply problematic to me. We forgot to mention that soybean farmers in the US are irate because Argentina is competing with them for Chinese purchases of soybeans. You couldn't get a more toxic political mix here, and yet Trump administration totally unfazed goes in and bails out Argentina. Walk us through how that's possible and what your reaction to that is.
Yeah, I mean, there are so many different threads to this piece that I think sort of highlight the issues with this regime of statecraft and the way that it operates. Maybe I'll talk a little bit about Argentina. I'll also contrast it to what's happening with Argentina's neighbor Brazil, and some of the stuff that's going on there. You know, I think the Treasury's response to Argentina sort of highlights the way this regime operates and sort of muddies the water around what the government's trying to accomplish in this. As you said, there's one component of this. What the Secretary said initially was there is a financial stability risk here if the US does not help Argentina, help it to stabilize the peso, stabilize its economy and its politics. That's the reason the US, and in particular Treasury, but also other technocrats, have intervened in Argentina in the past. Was it was viewed as one of the heavyweights in Latin America, and if there were issues there, it would spill over into the US. But it is not the same and not as connected to the US economy as a Mexico would be in the peso crisis in Mexico that happened decades ago. But nonetheless, what the Secretary was saying was a very much technocratic argument. We got to do this for financial stability purposes. We have no choice. It's going to hurt us economically if we don't step in and prop up these markets. But then he also went on TV and basically said, like, I'm trying to help get this regime through to the next election. So, like, I'm making these technocratic arguments, but then the mask falls away, and I'm also helping this regime that the current US government views as having values that are consistent with its own. The calculus is as simple as that. They are a libertarian government that shares some of our ideals and some of our politics. We want to help them. And there's other countries we don't want to help and won't extend these privileges to. And so that's why we're making this choice. The third part of this that you're talking about is, oh, and by the way, some of these connected financial institutions have connections back to the US government and well-connected public officials. So you're helping your political friends abroad, but also your friends who have invested and speculated on the Argentine peso, who are going to get help through this. So it's sort of the muddying of, are we doing statecraft? Are we doing financial stability? Who are we helping for what reason? And again, that's why I think there got to be guardrails around these policies, because officials can just do a lot of hand waving about what's happening here and try to justify it. But it is not being transparent about the mechanisms to which it is using, for example, the Exchange Stabilization Fund, how the structure of the financing arrangements are going to work, sort of the mechanisms, what the holdings are going to be within the ESF itself. And so there's also a lot of opacity about the arrangement and the financing itself. When the US committed these resources, what it intends to do in the future, is it going to spend the full $20 billion it says it has committed? There's just got to be more congressional oversight of this to also sort of unpack, like, what are we even trying to accomplish here? I don't know how to get into the soybean stuff, but as you said, like, purely thinking about it from a, like, are these our political friends, doesn't represent the full way in which using finance has other implications for things like industrial or agricultural policy. But it highlights the point that who the US chooses to finance has a broader set of economic implications. Sometimes it will implicate strategically important industrial sectors. Sometimes finance is the tool to think about how you manufacture chips and some of these other sectors. Sometimes it has to do with agriculture, but that finance really sits behind a number of other strategically important economic sectors, and is really kind of unique in that way, in the way that it flows across the border, but also is created by the government in the first instance. I mentioned Brazil, and I mentioned that because there were some reports a couple of weeks ago about the US government also wanting to maybe impose trade-related sanctions on Brazil, because Brazil created its own public, real-time, fast, low-cost payment system that it forces banks to, if they want to operate in Brazil, they got to sign up for this public payment system. And ostensibly, what trade authorities are saying is this is anti-competitive for us. If you make our payment companies, think your PayPals, your Venmos of the world, but also maybe Visa, MasterCard, or US banks, sign up for this system, then it's going to undercut them competitively and it's going to be bad for them. And this is a matter of trade policy. But it shouldn't be lost on anyone that this US government has an issue with what is happening in Brazil and their domestic politics, and the fact that they are prosecuting the former president there, who is friends with the current US president. And so they're trying to say, we would bring trade sanctions against Brazil because they have this public payment system. This should benefit US financial institutions, but also they have beef with Brazil because they're going after President Bolsonaro too. So again, like, are we doing statecraft here? Are we doing some sort of other kind of financial and trade policy? Or we're just trying to help the US president's friends who are trying to punish its allies by using these coercive measures? Like, what is happening here? We need more clarity. And these resources really and tools need to be cabined in, because any regime can come in and try to abuse them for their own ends. Right now, it might be punishing Brazil and helping Argentina. In a future administration, the roles might be reversed, again, without any sort of coherent theory about why these tools are being brought to bear in the way that they are.
In some ways, it's actually nice that the Trump administration is so overt in like why it's doing it. You know, like even if they say some pretend stuff, they're just like, we like these people, we're going to help them, they're our friends. Like the Obama years to me was deeply frustrating because I think they were doing that too and using the technocratic excuse, but like not being like lying about why, you know, or just not saying why really, just kind of putting the full technocratic exercise out. I mean, or, you know, even the Biden administration to some extent, no offense for when you were there, but, you know, there's something refreshing about that. But then on the other hand, you're saying that the actual mechanism is still super opaque and like it's not really any more transparent except for the underlying politics, which I'm not sure gets us all that far.
Yeah, no, I mean, you definitely saw this in the Biden administration for sure, where there were concerns about certain strategically important industrial sectors. You could think of the steel industry and the US Steel merger, for example, where there were concerns about US industrial policy in sectors that are important here, and jobs for certain unions and workers within some of those industries. The tool they were using would sometimes be like CFIUS, which is supposed to be a national security process in the first instance. And so there are questions of like, is this the right tool to try to accomplish this goal? Was this originally intended in this way? It might have been the best tool to be able to bring to bear because it was where the US government and the president had the most leverage in those processes. But then under a Trump administration, they're using CFIUS in new and different ways. They're doing these golden share arrangements now too. They're taking equity, again, a very sort of financially focused way of trying to have control over private industry. Each administration has tried to expand these tools in different ways for different purposes that I think then is useful for the next administration coming in to try to bend it to whatever their own purpose is. And so it just raises the stakes of elections sometimes and decisions about who the Treasury Secretary is, or who's running the National Security Council, the National Economic Council, because what are they going to want to do with these tools? How are they going to want to use them? Some of these folks are unelected. Some of them are even unconfirmed by the Senate, but they'll have a lot of power in this regime the more and more these tools get expanded.
And got a couple issues to get to. Want to make sure we get to them all. I saw an article in the FT, which I think is, you know, besides the Capital Forum, probably the best newspaper out there these days. But they had an article that was basically like showing how much bank deregulation there was going to be in the US and how that effectively was going to create a race with Europe on whether or not they were going to deregulate so they could stay competitive. Almost no ink given to financial stability, systemic risk, which is like ostensibly why these capital rules are in place in the first place. What's your sense of, are we really going to get this sort of race to the bottom on bank deregulation? And where do you see, and maybe we could pair this up with the systemic risk stuff, where do you see the most glaring cracks in the system? We've got private credit with the auto stuff recently. We've got crypto creeping into the banking sector. We've got, other big tech trying to control currency. We've got a lot of different issues going on. What do you see as the real systemic issues, things most likely to come up if we are going to have a race to the bottom on bank deregulation? Certainly seems like it's going to happen in the US, but unclear if we're going to get that in Europe as well.
I mean, I think there's an important, it's this administration, the secretary gave a speech in, I think it was March, where he said basically there are three key pillars to the president's America First agenda: financial deregulation, tariffs, and dollar sanctions. Those second and third categories are very much part of this statecraft toolkit, but they view deregulation as a facilitator of these other policies. The way he has talked about it is, we want to re-leverage the private sector and have them go out and be our national champions globally. And again, we'll like win-win-win. They'll profit and we'll get to throw our weight around, and that'll be great. But what we have seen when they've tried to use some of these other tools is that they create financial instability, right? When he imposed the tariffs, it created stress in the US Treasury markets. The response to that from the administration was, well, let's just do more deregulation. That'll let them blow out their balance sheets even more, and that will sort of solve the problem. My argument in the paper is, it is just the opposite of that. These institutions can't be too big to fail. They have to be well regulated and resilient to be able to absorb those moments of stress. So I think this idea of deregulation as the panacea for using these other sets of statecraft measures is actually going to be self-defeating over the long run, because it's not going to make them effective. These institutions in the financial system is going to be less resilient, so they're not going to serve as effective conduits for this regime. But also, nothing will undermine the US global financial leadership more than having financial instability, having too big to fail banks, having crises and bailouts. That seeds US global leadership. That financial instability creates political instability. It makes us look bad to the rest of the world that we don't have our act together. And it further erodes the rest of the world's confidence in our ability to be effective financial stewards of this global dollar system. So it's a self-defeating agenda fundamentally when you put the pieces together. Now, is the EU actually trying to get into a race to the bottom with the US, or is it trying to turn this thing that the US is trying to use as a competitive advantage into a source of vulnerability? They've done very interesting moves at various points in basically trying to target the US financial sector and financial system when the US has taken punitive measures. So when the president imposed the Liberation Day tariffs, the European Commission's response was to use something called the anti-coercion instrument to basically threaten to tax US banks and tech firms and debar them all from contracts with European Union countries. So basically what they decided was tech and finance are the two strategically important sectors for the United States. We're going to target them specifically and try to turn them into a vulnerability and threaten to retaliate against those institutions in particular. And so are they really trying to get into a race to the bottom, or are they basically just trying to say to the US, like, if you want to deregulate, we want our own deregulation or other things in return. And so what are you going to give us as part of this system? Not clear to me what the game is that they are playing there. But over time, I think the issue is the U.S. is going to again cede its leadership position. One of the key lessons of the global financial crisis was financial instability in any one of these globalized economies is everyone's problem. It is not just the problem of that individual country, and that's particularly true in the case of the United States. And so that's why there were a lot of multilateral reforms and these other bodies that were created, which the U.S. is stepping back from. I think you can look back on, there was a story in Reuters, which is another good outlet, in May, that reported the European Central Bank was testing what its financial institutions would do if the president got control over the Federal Reserve and then tried to cut off European banks' access to dollar funding. How would they respond to that? And so some of the deregulation is going to cede the US's central role here, but also politicization of institutions like the Fed will also further diminish the US's role from a regulatory perspective, but also as the administrator of this global dollar system too. So I think there are ways in which some of these other countries are looking at how the US is mismanaging its role in the middle of this regime and thinking about how they can take strategic advantage of that, how they can sort of insulate themselves, and probably thinking about what alliances can they make with other countries to have some of these alternative systems. I don't think they need to fully displace the dollar in order to actually create a problem for the US and create leverage over the US. There just have to be credible alternatives, other ways of electronic and other kinds of payments, to then get the US to sort of think like, oh gosh, how do we back ourselves out of this and how do we regain our centrality in this system?
On mute. Okay. Last question. We already talked about like what a more positive vision for financial statecraft would be, so we don't need to get into that. But one thing that comes up a lot in night trade conversations is when you have a concern about the rule of law and democracy in a place like the US, does that create an opportunity for other countries to fill that void? And I think we had a mini example of this, and you could disagree if you think otherwise. But when the US said, when Trump said, hey, the EU needs to get their act together and NATO countries need to spend more on their defense, they need to stop free riding. And then Germany and other European countries are like, all right, we'll borrow some money and we'll pay for some weapons, you know. And then all of a sudden, investors just like flock in to those stocks and those countries. It was also at the same time you were seeing some really radical positions by the Trump administration on rule of law. To what extent do you see financial statecraft? You know, obviously, I think at some level, trade more broadly has implications with democracy and rule of law, and where investors think that is, you know, contributing to, you know, political and financial stability. But when you think about financial statecraft, how much of a role do those things play into the strength of a country's hand or opportunity? And just curious to get your thoughts.
Yeah. I mean, I think it is central to this entire system. I think, do the administrators of the system adhere to domestic laws and international norms? It's a central part of being a reliable source of global finance that investors and other countries can trust and feel like can be a reliable partner in this. Because fundamentally, it is a global partnership that others have to want to sign up for and be a part of. And I think if it just becomes an undependable system where the president's friends get benefits and the president's adversaries in a given moment get cut off and get penalized, then no one's going to want to be a part of that system because it's unpredictable, it is highly contingent and personality driven, and no one's going to view that as a reliable safe haven. And so part of what undermines this system are the US's ability to be a reliable international partner. So when the ECB thinks that maybe the Fed's not going to use its dollar swap lines anymore, that undermines the system and the US centrality in it on the one hand. But also some of these domestic moves of sort of politicizing some of these agencies and having the president try to throw his weight around and not adhere to laws and norms and trying to confiscate people's property or bring criminal charges against them, that upends the system too, and suggests that some of these domestic laws that determine the way that this geopolitical system operates are up for grabs again and cannot actually be relied upon. And so can people really be a part of that system? So I think it is all connected. And then the regulation piece of it is sort of layered on top of that too, which is this financial system going to be resilient over the longer term, or is it just going to be boom, bust, and crash? And then again, the president's friends get bailouts, and his enemies are sort of left to their own devices, essentially. And so I think that's an essential part of this. And I think markets don't fully understand some of the moves and the nuances of this. And so they're not always reacting in the way that I would argue they should, given how much this system is actually being upended at the moment.
All right, last question, I promise, really quickly. Another thing that happens when in the trade conversation is the US just kind of continually falls back on us being the dominant consumer. China falls back on having monopoly power over specific chemicals, inputs, what have you, in the supply chain. Maybe also their machine, their engineering capacity. How do you think about financial statecraft and monopoly and issues like that? Does that come into how you think about it? I mean, obviously we talked about too big to fail banks, but are there other monopoly issues that come up that you saw in your paper when you're like, oh, this is an element of financial statecraft?
Yeah, I think I refer to it in passing in one of the footnotes in particular about the payment system, where, like, from a government's perspective, I think the conventional thinking is things like economies of scale and frankly monopolistic dynamics in some of these markets redound to the benefit of this regime. Because if you have one global payment messaging service, or you have a couple of dominant global payment providers, or you have a small handful of banks whose GDPs would be the third largest country or largest economy in the world, all of that helps you, at least in theory, throw your financial weight around. And so some of the dynamics that drive monopolies and the creation of too big to fail financial institutions on the one hand, just at a very sort of simplified and intuitive levels, seem like they were down to the benefit of these statecraft policies, because more finance and more US controlled finance is viewed as an unmitigated good. And I'm trying to complicate that a bit and try to say that there are other factors that come into play that would preserve the US finance as a central part of this system, and tipping too far into monopoly or into too big to fail problem are actually going to make the system worse, harder to administer, create a bunch of these unwanted and unintended consequences like financial instability and bailouts that are just going to undermine the system over the longer term. So there's a superficial intuitive appeal to the idea that you want a small group of monopolistic providers, but it's going to actually create a more complex set of problems.
And to your point earlier, who's really in charge? Is a question also.
How dynamic for sure. Yeah.
Graham, it's great to see you.
All right.
Thank you so much for doing this. This was an incredible conversation. I had such a good time catching up and talking about it all. And thanks to all of our listeners as well. Graham, it's great to have you. This concludes today's call. Thank you so much for joining us. If you found the conversation helpful or thought-provoking, please be sure to follow the Capital Forum on LinkedIn, X, and Blue Sky for breaking news, policy updates, and information on upcoming events. We'd love to hear from you. Drop us a line at events@tcfpress.com. That's events@tcfpress.com. If you have ideas for future topics, speakers, or just want to connect with us, we'd be delighted to hear from you. Have a great day, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.